close enough. The NIST panel, some of these folks came together a few months ago for Richard Schwartz International Conference in Berkeley. It's great to see some of them back, and I think there's a lot of great information. We've already heard snippets of the impact that crowdfunding is having on the international community. Now we actually, rather than just kind of hear it on the periphery, we get to talk to some of the sources. So I'd like to turn the time over to Brian Kosak. How'd I do, Brian? Okay, great. We'll go ahead and turn the time. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. We're talking about international crowdfunding, and let me start off with saying thank you. Thank you to America, regulators, crowdfunding enthusiasts for developing the framework, the concepts, because this is not just a made in America solution. These concepts are getting exported internationally, and people are paying attention, and they care about the very issues that you are looking at and caring about, and also debating quite vigorously of what is the right solution for their own countries, whether it's Europe or Canada or around the world. Whether a portal is regulated, that's not an American concept. It's a concept that's pretty basic in securities law, or how much money can an issuer raise, or other requirements, background checks. And I think coming from Canada, I can tell you that the Canadian experience is very much looking at what is happening in America, especially with, as Doug mentioned, Elenoff this morning, the 556 plus pages, and then FINRA had all their volumes of documents. And actually last week in Canada, they also unleashed hundreds of pages of documents in crowdfunding, where they are also looking at the American experience and otherwise. So we have a panel today of various people that are going to share with you this international experience. And I thought I would ask each of them to introduce themselves and explain what their focus is on the international aspect of crowdfunding. So if I can start from my immediate right here with Katie.
Yes, thank you. I'm Katie Suominen. I'm a founder of TradeUp. We're actually sponsoring this panel. I'm very pleased to be here. We are today launching, so it's our first birthday, if you will. I'm pleased to share our birthday with so many of you. We are a equity crowdfunding platform for globalizing companies, companies that are exporting, that are investing overseas, that are planning to do so. And we help these companies access accredited investors, access about $100,000 and up in debt and equity financing. For various growth purposes, whether it's for international growth, whether it's for production expansion, growth in the US that helps these companies expand their international presence. And why focus on this segment? Well, over and over, research shows that globalizing companies outperform. They outperform the broader market, the domestic companies, by wide margins in revenue growth, in productivity, in stability, you name it, by all metrics. Yet, in survey after survey, you see globalizing companies citing lack of capital as the leading constraint to international trade, to international expansion. And this is the financing gap that we intend to bridge with TradeUp.
Great, thank you. Humphrey.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Humphrey Polanen. I'm with iBankers Direct. We're an equity funding platform that's FINRA compliant and licensed. We just received our license as a broker-dealer just a couple of weeks ago. Took us about a year. We have operations and people in Switzerland, in Italy, in Stamford, Connecticut, in New York City, and Palo Alto. And I'm the West Coast representative of the company. We focus on raising money for companies that fall in what we call the Series A gap, if you will. Bigger than angels, smaller than VC rounds, sort of in the 1 to 2, 1 to 3 range. We do both equity and debt. We are industry or vertical agnostic. We operate across, we have had deals for a furniture company, for a life sciences company, high-tech, consumer-facing, cybersecurity. And so we are agnostic, but we do require a company to be in a growth stage. So hopefully the market and the technology risk has been taken out because they have customers and revenue, and they are on a nice trajectory. What we've learned in the last year is that there are great companies and a lot of investors outside of Silicon Valley, and so we've had greater success with investors who don't necessarily see the deal flow that a VC or an angel group would see here in the Valley. We have a lot of activity in Europe. We have a life sciences practice in Europe. And our DNA really is international because the company was started as a bricks and mortar broker-dealer and investment bank 18 years ago. And in that period, we raised over $6 billion in capital, or were on the cover of those offerings. And so, you know, we go back as a company that started initially as a US, European co-based company. And so we're very comfortable operating across national boundaries.
Thank you. We are very privileged also to have a guest from Italy, Alessandro. They have been doing wonderful things in Europe, in particular Italy, with crowdfunding. So please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what's happening generally with yourself and crowdfunding in Italy.
Thank you, Brian. My name is Alessandro Lerro. I am an Italian lawyer, and I think to be the only European professional in this room. And for 25 years, I've been working and advising in innovation, new technologies, venture capital, and taking care of some family offices in Italy and in Southern Europe. In crowdfunding, I'm advisor of one of the oldest crowdfunding platform in the world. It is an Italian platform, reward-based, that was started in 2005. And in equity crowdfunding, I'm pretty much involved. I wrote a book about equity crowdfunding law in Italy, which has been published by the main publisher of economic publications, Sole 24 Ore. And also I published a translation in English of the Italian equity law that could be a benchmark for several countries in the world. And I'm also writing a book with David Drake about investors of Italy. And I recently founded a company aiming to do executive education and crowdfunding, targeting especially communication and media. And now I'm working for the creation of a business association of equity crowdfunding platforms in Italy and also at the European level with other EU nationals.
Great. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask Yoko to explain what you guys are doing in international crowdfunding, and yourself.
Yes, I'm Jouko Ahvenainen from CrowdVC Group, and CrowdVC is basically a holding company nowadays, and we own or have a stake in 10 different companies that are operating in crowdfunding area globally. Actually, TradeUp is one of the companies where we have stake. Then we have, for example, CrowdValley, that is one of the sponsors also today, and they have basically the platform and ecosystem for crowdfunding. We started actually to work with equity crowdfunding 2008, and I think that we are the first company in the world that started to work with equity crowdfunding, and in that point actually it was impossible to start in the US, and we actually started our first operations in the UK and Hong Kong. And since then we have had operations in Europe, Asia, and nowadays also quite a lot in the US. And we also participated here in the US to this work basically to get the new regulation, and we have also talked quite a lot with SEC and basically also given our international experience and what we have seen in different countries in this area. And we started with startup crowdfunding, but nowadays we have companies for many kind of investment models and different kind of securities and assets, including real estate, commodities, and also basically companies and businesses in different phases. And we have really seen that when crowdfunding very much started with startup investing, nowadays it is much more, and basically it can work for many kind of online investment marketplaces for different kind of assets and securities around the world.
Thank you very much. Wanted to switch into talking about a particular crowdfunding regime in Italy. If Alessandro, you can explain to us, I mean, everyone obviously here understands the Jobs Act and crowdfunding. I'll be happy to share with you what's happening in Canada because it's progressing very quickly. But let me ask you this. Maybe you can also, so people understand, you know, an Italian flavor of this, but also the European flavor. I mean, there's publications that were just released in the UK looking at equity crowdfunding, P2P lending. Italy has come up with something, I believe, last year. Maybe you can kind of explain what is crowdfunding in Italy, who is it for, and if you can compare to the best you can some of the features of the US Title III model, that would be helpful for the audience as well.
Yes, Brian, with pleasure. Well, Italy copied the Jobs Act, but did it faster and I think also better for some aspects. We can raise up to 5 million euro, which is more or less $7 million per year. And there are no personal investment limit, but a procedure to test the proclivity to risk investment on the founder side. And for now, you can invest only on companies which have strong innovation, strong technology, but by the end of the year, it will be probably possible to invest on any kind of company, so small, medium-sized company. What is interesting in the Italian model is that the crowdfunding platform has to partner with a broker-dealer. So the final part of the purchase of the share must be run through the broker-dealer in a protected environment. So this brings us to have a very, very strong protection of the consumer. There are a lot of withdrawals right, protection for the consumer, so to ensure that the investment is safe. At European level, this is a leading legislation. The UK legislation, which was published at the beginning of March and is effective since April 1st, has copied much from our legislation, while the French and the Spain legislation are still not ready. Probably something will come up by the end of the summer. But what is important and very interesting is that last Thursday, the European Commission has issued a communication. A communication is a non-legislative paper setting the political lines of the European community in a certain area. Well, in this communication, the Commission acknowledged the huge potential of crowdfunding to complement traditional sources of financing and to contribute to the growth of economy. And in this document, the European Commission has set a plan which is made of measures in order to support the expansion of crowdfunding throughout the community, to study and to explore the market, to raise awareness, to provide information and training to everybody, and what is most important, I think, to encourage the exchanges of industry best practice and cross-border activities, which is for us lawyers one of the most difficult issues to analyze and to use. 81% of the reward-based platforms in Europe operates cross-border, and a further 14% would like to do that in the next months. Instead, as far as equity crowdfunding is concerned, there are more difficulties, as you all know.
Great. What are some of the issues that are being debated in Europe and Italy? And if other panelists have knowledge of this, feel free to jump in. I'll tell you after what some of the issues are in Canada, but are there certain things that the regulators are stressing about in regulating this and opening it up? From what you've been reading and your knowledge? Well,
the most important issue is the application of the MiFID procedure. The MiFID procedure is what I mentioned about the check of the proclivity to risk investment. Well, all the countries in Europe have the MiFID procedures because it is common legislation. The problem with MiFID is that the questionnaire must be signed in front of a broker-dealer. So when we are dealing with cross-border activities, it is very difficult for a platform in a certain country to have contacts not only with a broker-dealer which is partnered in its own country, but also with broker-dealer abroad, or otherwise you need to have a broker-dealer as partner who has subsidiaries abroad in the continent. So this is the most difficult issue, and something that at the European level we should face as a business association. And under this point of view, I want to ask you, what is your experience as a business association in Canada? Because you are a benchmark for all of us. You are the first country, I think, to make a business association with specific purposes and with the idea to create value for the platform aggregator.
Sure, I think that's a segue into some of the other things I'm doing. I'm a lawyer with Castles, Brock & Blackwell in Toronto. We're a full-service law firm, but I'm also chair of the Private Capital Markets Association of Canada. We just changed our name. We used to be called the Exempt Market Dealers Association of Canada. And I guess what that would mean to you is if you had your private placement marketplace and had a specific dealer that would be able to do those transactions, that's what's called an exempt market dealer in Canada. So it's not a full-on broker-dealer, it's something less than that. So there's a lot of changes going on in Canada in terms of the new ways to raise capital, but along the way came crowdfunding. And it's interesting that I got involved in late 2012, and I remember I met Doug Elenov and others who are leading the charge here and trying to understand how the framework would be built here in America. And it just seems that equity crowdfunding in Canada lends itself to a very specific area. And recently I was involved with another gentleman, Oscar Joffrey from Board Suite, in setting up the Equity Crowdfunding Alliance of Canada. Because some of the challenges are, we're trying to distinguish in Canada the difference between equity and non-equity, because we find that they're being confused and the media's not understanding the difference between rewards-based and equity. But also the next challenge is, as you at least have language here about Title II, Title III, people understand crowdfunding as more of the Jobs Act. And in setting up Equity Crowdfunding Alliance, we're trying to just focus on the equity side. And let me start off with saying equity crowdfunding is legal in Canada. And it has been for years. And that is the exact view of the British Columbia Securities Commission. So let me back up and say, why am I saying that? When you look internationally, countries are actually using existing laws, prospectus exemptions, and registrations to crowdfund. And if you look at crowdfunding, you can look at it as selling securities over the internet, or you can look at it as going directly to the crowd, like the public. And you have accredited crowdfunding. We had real estate panel earlier talking about how they're doing that. So in terms of it is legal in Canada, you have this exempt market dealer that sets up a platform, and it can raise capital online, put their deals online through accredited investors, just like here. But also we have a very interesting exemption that's called the Offering Memorandum Exemption. So here you have PPMs, private placement memorandums. Imagine, if you will, if there was a prescribed form of how you had to complete that. You then could get that offering document, and yes, in Canada has audited financial statements, and a risk acknowledgement form, and you can give that and raise capital from the public. So that's why regulators such as BC say that we've been crowdfunding in Canada for a while now, and they are actually promoting that model. So earlier last week, March 20th I should say, Canada, especially Ontario, has been doing a lot of work in crowdfunding. And similar like Europe, we don't have a national securities regulator. We have 13 jurisdictions. They all have to work together. So it's interesting that you had your hundreds and hundreds of pages come out last fall. We actually had hundreds and hundreds of pages of legislation, I should say proposal, a framework come out, and we had to figure out which province landed where. So what I've prepared is a little infographic we'll be sending out later that kind of lays out the different jurisdictions. But in terms of what the ecosystem that was created, which is kind of neat, at one end they've done a startup exemption, no registration in the portal. the startup can raise up to $300,000. An investor can put in $1,500. That's a proposal that's being looked at by 5 provinces. And one province to do it last year was Saskatchewan, where crowdfunding is legal under a framework like that, very, very light. If you move up the ecosystem, I call it the SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, that's the equity crowdfunding framework that Ontario started creating, and now 5 other jurisdictions, including Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, et cetera, have joined. And it is modeled very much on the Jobs Act, some interesting differences. I'm hearing, 2.0, we need a 2.0 here, jobs. Under that framework, the equity crowdfunding framework, you can raise up to $1.5 million, not one. But in terms of the investor limits, don't necessarily mirror the limits as they have here. It's $2,500 per investment, and no more than $10,000 from an investor in any 12-month period. The portal has to be registered. When you move up to that, you then have your credit investor, and you also have your offering memorandum exemption, which has to be done by an exempt market dealer. So you can see the whole ecosystem. After that, you can go public. They're trying to allow this to happen. The interesting opportunities for you and for Canada is basically a cross-border portals. In terms of, let's say, a US broker-dealer or portal working with an exempt market dealer in Canada, really gets interesting for a Canadian investor like myself to access deals in the Valley here, and maybe for certain investors in New York, Chicago, in the Valley looking at a really neat oil and gas deal in Calgary or a tech deal from Waterloo. This is where it gets interesting. And when you add in Europe and other jurisdictions, it gets really exciting and interesting. So let me ask Katie if you could comment on what are you seeing in terms of the internationalization of companies and the globalization. Explain that more to us in terms of, let's say you have a company here in the Valley. Take them through. What does that mean in terms of where are they going, how are they raising capital and growing through what you guys are doing?
Well, that's a great question. We actually have one company from Canada expanding to the US market. It's a B Corp in Canada, and we're having that company on our platform, and that's kind of a reverse example. Well, if you're a US company, then you may be raising for any purpose. We have a couple of companies on our platform that are raising for a Series A, Series B rounds for growth. And these companies have tremendous international market opportunities, whether it's in the Middle East, North African market, or another company that has great opportunities in the European market. And they need capital for general growth. One company needs as humble things as to revamp their website and increase their manufacturing capability in China. The other company needs to expand its manufacturing capability right here in the US, in Ohio. And so these are the kinds of purposes, normal growth purposes, normal purposes that any company goes through to raise funding, but we enable particularly companies that are globalizing to raise through our platform, and we provide value-add services, aggregate kind of service providers that globalizing companies need to help them navigate the international market. Given that it's a very much of a field of details, exporting is, investing overseas is, and oftentimes companies lack this value-added advice along the way. So it's really is capital raising for companies by other means, if you will, and we focus on internationalizing companies. I'll tell you why. These companies, as I mentioned, outperform. It's a stunningly consistent finding. How well they are performing, and I'm sure many of you understand that kind of instinctively looking at export-driven companies compared to others. And they outperform not only because they export. Exporting enables companies to diversify their cash flow, to scale up, to identify new customer demands in overseas markets that a domestically operating company just wouldn't realize that are there. But the sort of a great secret is that when you're looking at globalizing companies and companies that are export-driven, these are a minority of any country's overall ecosystem of companies. In the US, only 1% of companies export, 300,000 out of 30 million companies. Now there's more and more companies looking into this. In Europe, it's probably 15% of companies that export. Canada is about the same. So it's the minority of companies, and the secret is that these companies are better to begin with. It is better performing companies, the go-getter companies, the high-growth companies that are far more likely to internationalize than companies that are kind of the laggard companies. And we have identified this segment as an outperforming basically an asset class that investors should focus on. It's a very high growth segment. A lot of companies around the world are looking to grow in overseas markets, whether you're in Latin America and US or Europe. Companies are eyeing at particularly emerging markets, and they typically lack financing.
Give us an example of a company, like an industry, so that you're looking at, or that would be perfect for your platform.
Well, these are typically companies, let's say, $5 million revenue company, $10 million revenue.
So these are not startups, these are established companies with real EBITDA.
Absolutely. So we're ideally looking at $500,000 in revenue and up. Could be smaller. One of the companies on our platform has 100,000 in revenue, but they are extremely savvy about international markets. And ideally, these companies are already exporting. Ideally, they have some international exposure, so they've kind of overcome that hump, that learning curve as to what it takes to operate in international markets. And then they need further capital for further growth. And typically,
Katie, how much capital do you think you'll be raising? What will be your sweet spot? I know it's early for your company, but do you have an idea of what will emerge?
Yeah, it's what we're starting to see is it's both small scale at one level, so it could be, well, we need $100,000 for increase our manufacturing capability, redo our website, whatever it is, or it is kind of we're entering a funding round, whereas Series A round, B, whatnot, and we need $5 million. So this is very typical. Like we're entering a growth phase, and we're starting to raise another round, and those vary then from $5 million typically to $10 million or so in size.
Great. Humphrey, how about yourself? How do you see companies onboarding, going international?
Well, typically what we have seen in the last year is that there are a number of companies outside the U.S. who want to come to the U.S. If they're technology companies, typically Silicon Valley, media companies, New York. And so they're trying to build a client base or an investor base in the U.S. to support the activity they already have started in the U.S. So there's a French company. It has an office in San Francisco. It has very large clients, data centers as customers. They are doing business in the U.S., but they're looking for an investor base to support that business.
Are these strategic investors, Humphrey, or they're just looking for any investor?
These are financial investors who understand the space, who might be helpful to them in some ways, in their business, maybe with introductions or something like that.
Right. Let's talk about Grow VC. What are you seeing in terms of internationalizing the crowdfunding for certain companies looking to raise capital?
Yes, first of all, I would like to comment that actually I would say that crowdfunding is somehow happening in most of countries almost nowadays, but there might be different kind of limits what you can do, what kind of investors you can have, how much money you can take, so that it is not only Italy or Canada, but for example, our companies, I think that they are operating more than 50 countries around the world, not only in North America and Europe, but also, for example, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so on. So that, for example, we have had some operations, for example, in India and China. We actually started, was it 3 or 4 years ago, the first crowdfunding service in Kenya together with World Bank. So that they are just examples that actually it is happening now really globally, and it is really coming important part of the investment ecosystem. And as I said also earlier, it is not only for the startups, but it is really coming for many kind of assets, many kind of securities, and for example, one good example is clean tech, and also, for example, different kind of solutions for renewable energy like solar and so on. So that there are really a lot of variations, and I think that we are going to see actually much more examples, so that I think that the whole market will be in that way combination of many investment models, many different industry focus marketplaces, and also many kind of investment instruments, how the investments actually happen.
When you look at international crowdfunding from a Canada-US perspective, we share a lot of common things, including a common language. And I just wanted to point one item out in the Canadian crowdfunding model. Is for public companies as well. And I know it's getting a lot of people excited because there's a lot of venture issuers that are stock exchange listed that can't even raise 1.5 million. So they're pretty excited about the opportunity to raise money through that method. So let me switch into the obvious, language, cultural barriers, and looking at international investors. You have an American company that is used to American investors, and Katie, you talked about accessing different international markets. But what are some of the issues or concerns or things that you're going to be starting to think about more in terms of managing different languages? Like I'm just thinking, obviously we have Quebec and Canada. In certain circumstances, the offering documents have to be translated into French. And I'm going to get to Alessandro in a moment, where we have many languages in Europe. Katie, maybe we can start with you. What are your thoughts in terms of how do you manage an international crowd that has different cultures, expectations, and more sort of language, not only from the offering, like what is the offering document? Do you just get it all translated? But more so managing the crowd, the investors, once they're in.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're probably a couple of months away from exactly making all that happen. But for our purposes, the target market really is U.S. companies that are expanding overseas or foreign companies coming to the U.S. So for now, we do okay with English, but there is also the issues as to when a foreign company comes to the U.S., does that company's country allow for crowdfunding to begin with, or if foreign investors want to invest through us, does their jurisdiction allow for them to do that? So it's more on the regulatory side perhaps for us at this point. But I'll tell you though, it's interesting, we see a lot of demand. I get this on a daily basis. They somehow find us. We're rather new in the cyberspace, but they still find us. And we get mail from all around the world. This is very much of a global theme. There's a lot of companies in Europe. I posted us on LinkedIn, and lo and behold, next day we have 2 emails from India, 1 from Cameroon, 1 from Spain, 1 from Germany, 1 from the UK, entering the US market or in general expanding internationally, needing capital for growth, whether it's working capital to fulfill an export order or general growth capital. So there's demand. So far it's been rather easy to do in English, but once it gets to the regulatory issues and the translating the documents, I'm sure it's going to be more complicated. So I'm sure others have more experience with that.
Yeah, Humphrey, I think you mentioned earlier about dealing with a French company.
Right.
So I'm very interested in seeing how does that French company come here and obviously, come to the world's largest capital markets, and what are some of the issues and concerns with their understanding of how it works versus your onboarding? And what I also want to get into is, you mentioned all these countries, Katie. I'm thinking, don't you as a platform pick your place? I mean, you can't do every country, because the real estate panel earlier we heard about, you want to have the developer that comes back and the portal and the developer knows one another, and it's easier to onboard and do more deals. So if you could share your thoughts, Humphrey, that'd be great.
So my view is that English has emerged as the language globally of the web, with very few exceptions. So we typically work in English in our documentation. And you can make a comparison to international trade, where most trade documents, if a Korean and a Chinese are doing business, it'll typically be in English. Now, still a lot of hand-holding and education is involved in terms of the entrepreneurs who want to come to the US or go outside the US. And for that, we operate with a multilingual, multicultural staff. So, in our small company, we cover probably 8 or 9 different languages.
Alessandro, I know you come from a very diverse continent with many languages. I'm very curious, what are the thoughts amongst the regulators? I haven't even gone into how do we internationalize this at the IOSCO level, which is the International Organization of Securities Regulators, who's publishing or has published recently some information on the internationalization of crowdfunding globally.
Yes, they did, but strangely they don't speak about the languages, and no regulation, no national regulation speaks about the language. So I think that the opportunity to use several languages will be something which will allow companies to differentiate and to offer better services to their subscriber. Concerning the different culture, there are several expressions of that. For instance, in Europe, there is no difference between accredited and non-accredited investors. And in Italy, there is one single legislation for retail investor and for expert investor. Another interesting difference is about securities. I mean, in Italy, you can crowdfund only equity. Nobody crowdfund debt, but it is not in the culture of the company to invest in debt. Only banks invest in debt. So there's something really, really different with America. And
in a good way, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Something which is also very interesting is that the USA world of crowdfunding, I think, is investor-driven. Most of what people write about crowdfunding is about the opportunity to have democratization of finance and access from everybody to investment. Instead, in Europe, crowdfunding is a phenomenon which is mainly startup-driven. So what it is interesting is how can I get money to fund my startup? So two different perspectives that are expression of two different cultures.
If I can add one comment that actually one area, of course, where the US is the leading market is a kind of domestic finance market that is very significant compared, for example, that in many other countries the local finance market is much smaller. And for example, if we talk about Europe, even European Union is a kind of one market nowadays. But if we talk about finance market and investing market, it is not really one market. There are still quite a lot of obstacles. And for example, I have been expert member in some work groups in European Union also that how to develop, for example, the finance market in Europe. And I think that one good example is that there are still 40 stock exchanges in Europe. And I have said to people in European Union that it doesn't make any sense if you want to have a strong finance market where you can have companies that could, for example, compete with companies from the US, India, China, and so on. But it's, of course, a very political and complex question because most of countries want to have their own national systems. So that I actually see opportunities in crowdfunding when it is much more internet-oriented and a kind of young people-oriented and English-speaking oriented, that actually it can maybe create a kind of more European market also for the finance compared to the traditional finance market.
It's interesting when we deal with international borders, there are, from my understanding, what I'm told, there's some portals, let's say, that are existing in America that are accepting money from Canadian investors. And I think when we look at internationally, whether it's Europe or South America, every country has the borders around it. And I think for crowdfunding portals looking to do business in other jurisdictions, it's a jurisdiction by jurisdiction analysis. So even though you have Canadians, let's say, pinging American portals, getting more information, signing up, a portal here can't take money legally. They'd have to work with an exempt market dealer. And I know also from my friends on the panel here, internationally, I think that's a message as well, that you just can't have a global portal going around the world raising capital in accordance with the way things are done here. And I think it gives pause and leads to a final question, because I know we're wrapping up here, is we see crowdfunding expanding globally. There's more being written. What do you think should be done to internationalize it to allow capital to be raised easier by companies that are maybe going for different reasons, not necessarily that they can't raise capital. What do you think that the regulators can do to kind of work together, collaborate to make that easier for investors and for issuers? Katie, you want to start?
Well, that's a great question. I think part of the answer is something that Yoko was talking about, which is kind of harmonizing in certain advanced economies in particular, where regulators are very used to working together, where regulations are pretty mature, to come to agreement. So it would make perfect sense, if I make my little public policy pitch here, for instance, for the Canadian and US regulators to work together, or there to be some kind of a NAFTA regulation where the Mexican regulators, US and Canadian regulators work together to have one harmonized set of rules where, because the three markets are so integrated from the international trade perspective, there's a lot of companies crossing borders, Mexican companies expanding to US companies exporting to Mexico, a lot of Canadian companies in the mix, US companies doing business in Canada all the time, and a lot of these companies are bound to be raising money online going forward, given that the regulations in each country permit this to some extent. So it would make perfect sense. So I would think like some of these kind of trials in certain rather integrated markets like NAFTA, like the European Union, perhaps in the transatlantic context as well, would make perfect sense, and then to kind of globalize it from there.
Should countries adopt more of the American crowdfunding model to do that? Because it gets very up in Canada, we want a made in Canada solution, and we just take what you do and change a few things, to tell you the truth. But it's that deep thinking and analysis that's gone beyond, that's behind it, that the regulators feel comfortable looking at what is the made in Canada solution. Like, for example, in the proposed model in Canada, they've allowed public companies to participate. Your thoughts, Humphrey?
Well, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think where we are today is like the early days of e-commerce. If you recall, Amazon was shipping books all over the country, if we just limit it to the US. And the question was, should there be sales tax in what state, right, and who has the authority? So right now, I believe crowdfunding is operating below the radar screen of the regulators and below their capability of actually enforcing a lot of the cross-border activity. So right, they can regulate activity in their domestic markets, but they don't really have the reach and the ability, unless there's cooperation, to go outside and work across borders, especially once you get outside the European Union internationally. So I think, though, that the policies will catch up over time. And what I imagine and envision is some kind of regulatory framework like you have with the Postal Union or the ITU, the Telecommunications Union, where countries have come together at the UN level or at the supra-regional level and created sort of regulating procedures and organizations.
Thank you.
But I think that time is years away.
Alessandro, very, very important, yes, what's happening in Europe.
Well, here in the States, you do not have problem in raising money. You have 53% more or less of about $52 billion a year of venture capital. Well, outside the States, funding money is a problem. Now, I think that crowdfunding, equity crowdfunding, investment crowdfunding will work only if you have access to the crowd. And to the crowd means to the international crowd, not only limited to a territory. So I think that what we should do is to abolish all the burdens to formal authorizations, payments, et cetera, within a framework where broker-dealer operates according to their national regulation. But we have to abolish as much as burdens as possible.
Thank you. Yoko?
Yeah, I have very practical approach for this. I think that laws and regulation always follows what really happens. And in that way, I believe that it's just start to happen. I would say that nobody can stop it, that people invest also in other countries. And also in the US, people are interested to get investors, for example, from Asia and vice versa. So that I see that there will be more and more international investments. Actually, my co-founder have said sometimes that think about situation when those young people who have always learned to use Facebook, when they really start to make investments. Are they going to make the investments in the same way as people have done the last 50 years? Probably not. They use internet much more to make investments, and it is not so big deal if something is in the US or in Italy or Canada or India or Indonesia and so on. And it might be hard for local regulators first to handle it because they are basically losing their power also. But I believe that it is going to happen. Maybe there will be some international agreements in the future, but it's anyway going to happen.
Thank you. These are very good comments from our esteemed panel. Let me kind of take it from a Canadian perspective, right beside America. If we don't do something, then our best and brightest will go to where they can get funded. And I think the politicians in Canada know that, and the regulators know that. And we have a funding crisis in Canada where companies are looking to raise capital anywhere from the startup to more mature companies, even public companies. And I think that's the environment that, whether you're in Canada, the US, and even internationally, that's what's happening. Companies need access to capital. I also think politically and internationally, this is a good thing because just as you're all here and others will be watching this after the conference, we're all increasing the entrepreneurial IQ of investors and just people that want to know what it's like to start a business. And there's no guarantee of success or otherwise. I think other people said earlier that whether you're businesses will fail for many reasons. They're just putting these things, I think it was, sorry, it was the real estate panel that said we're putting what we do online. And I think very much that is what's happening. It's moving online, and the regulators are grappling with technology versus securities law that are finally coming together, and they're trying to work themselves out that it's not an environment where there's no regulation, and at the same time it can't be too much regulation. It's interesting to see on the panel that it is something that issuers are trying to figure out the cost of capital, whether they do it on a portal here, there, or in Europe. And investors are saying, you know, the democratization of investing, that they want access to transactions. They want to put small amounts in and diversify. And I think that's the message. So I want to thank my panelists for your views, and perhaps next year we'll see where we're at internationally.